What the heck is a sorcerer? I imagine that's a fairly common question across D&D worlds. Unlike almost all the other player classes, the sorcerer is not defined by a worldly role, like fighters, monks, druids, or clerics. Nor do they have a real defining trait. Bards use performance and magic together, wizards have spellbooks, and rogues are very good at being criminals. A sorcerer is, ostensibly, someone born with magic in their very bones, or at least someone who has a close encounter with some obscure and unknowable magical force. Regardless of their origin, they gain the ability to control and manipulate the few spells they are capable of learning. They are one of only 2 classes who require a personal inciting incident or birthright to gain access to their powers, and they're the only class whose abilities are not conferred either by choice or by training. To quote the 5th edition Player's Handbook, sorcerers carry a magical birthright conferred upon them by an exotic bloodline, some otherworldly influence, or exposure to unknown cosmic forces. No one chooses sorcery. The power chooses the sorcerer. By this definition, all sorts of fictional characters could well be described as sorcerers. From Harry Potter to the Fantastic Four, from Gandalf to Sonic the Hedgehog, this origin describes almost every powered person in media. Either they were born special, some influence beyond them granted them powers, or something unknown out there in the universe gave them their power. Suffice it to say, the sorcerer has a serious identity problem. Indeed, even in the 5e community, there is an accepted misunderstanding that is quite common that suggests that sorcerers' power comes simply from their magical bloodline. This misconception is not universal, but it is certainly common. Firstly, it's worth noting this is actually true in Pathfinder and was true in 3rd edition. But the major factor in this misunderstanding in 5e's players is the Player's Handbook. Of the 2 Sorcerer's Origins released with the Player Handbook, one was Wild Magic, which was fodder for Chaos Gremlins everywhere, and the other was entitled Draconic Bloodline. It's worth noting that Wizards of the Coast tried to make it clear that Bloodline was not the only way to gain Sorcerer's magic, suggesting even in the Draconic Origin text that any given sorcerer could be the first of a new bloodline, as a result of a pact or some other exceptional circumstance. This unfortunately did little to disrupt the initial community impression that the sorcerer was either about having magic blood or being involved in lol random shenanigans. Besides, surely if your magic is the result of a pact, that makes you a warlock, right? I want to be clear. There are many who have noticed that sorcerers' origins do not necessarily tie themselves to bloodlines and blood magic. But there is a significant enough portion of the community who are under that impression. I think this is definitely worth talking about. Do stick around to the end for some world-building thoughts on how to make sorcerers feel a bit more stable as a class in your world, even if you've heard this bloodline argument before. To their credit, later subclasses have done much to try and remove this strange fascination with bloodlines, but these later subclasses have done little for, or actively worked against, any notion that the sorcerer has its own class identity. Now, along with dragon blood and random table magic, you can be a clericish sorcerer, a divination-ish sorcerer, a psionic-ish sorcerer, a stormy druidish sorcerer, or a shadowy warlockish sorcerer. So not only is the class identity unclear, amorphous, and kind of encroaching on some other classes' territory, it's also inextricably tied among some of the community to the rather unpleasant thought of blood purity. Sorcerers have only really one unique characteristic in their entire class design. They can use sorcery points for metamagic. Metamagic is the sorcerer's main draw. Although it is not incredibly well thematically tied to a sorcerer's origin, and you don't get it at level 1 like a wizard's spellbook. Nonetheless, metamagic options are a major feature of the sorcerer class. Despite this, many sorcerers only get to use a couple of metamagic options throughout most of their leveling curve, unless we're using optional rules. But metamagic can allow for some weird and wonderful effects, like doubling up a very, very limited selection of spells, re-rolling hits, or re-rolling damage numbers. Basically, because you're so innately suffused with magic, you're able to shape that magic to your will, bending those strict magical laws wizards hold near and dear to their hearts, like casting spells as a bonus action to free your action up to hit something, like the uncouth, uneducated urchin that you are. This works well enough for me. Sorcerers were instituted as a class in 3rd edition to rail against the Vancian magic of the wizard. Metamagic still fits that feeling of exuberant, rule-bending experimentation, although, I must admit, it could certainly be made available for 1st level sorcerers, and have a few more creative options. So that's Sorcerers, the class with the least individuality in 5th edition. Considering sorcery is a term from medieval France used to describe fortune tellers and hedge magicians, it's no small wonder that up until the 90s, sorcery and wizardry were basically the same thing. Given that, it's no surprise that the Sorcerer in 5th edition feels a little bit tacked on. But now that I've given them all that critique, I'd like to discuss how we can make sorcerers feel more interesting again. Firstly, you're really going to need to decide if you're actually going to bother with bloodlines or not. Either way, there's some really interesting stuff to explore. If you do decide to lean into it, then go to town. It's not just dragon's blood anymore. We've got to justify divine blood, blood ties affected by lunar cycles, and blood relations to neutral grand arbiters of law and order. This is where the fun and creativity begins. Especially in such a myriad setting as D&D, there are so many potential justifications. Perhaps your ancestor slayed a unicorn, sipping upon the beast's blood for a chance at immortality. Maybe that cursed blood has lain in your family ever since, tainting every successive generation, until you are born, finally, to break this curse upon your family name and emerge as the fulfillment of this great divine beast. Lycanthropy may not usually be a familial curse, but perhaps your father's condition has tied you inevitably to the waxing and waning of the moon. Perhaps, descended from generations of fishermen beholden to the tides, your blood is suffused with the power of the moon, and it lies dormant for an age before you finally awaken. Heck, it could be really interesting if, because of their background, a lunar sorcerer perceived their powers as tidal, not to do with the moon itself, until a sudden apotheosis and discovery as they learn their powers are not of this world but of the moon above. Perhaps as their level begins to grow and they begin to become more visually attached to the actual lunar surface. The clockwork soul doesn't require you to be mechanical in nature, or necessarily related to the Modrons. Perhaps instead you have some Fey blood, with your powers being represented by the interference of little household spirits, like brownies, who seek to redress certain imbalances for either good or ill, with a little bit of mischief thrown in. After all, Clockwork Cavalcade sounds a heck of a lot more fun when you imagine hordes of tiny Fey beings patching people and objects up and tickling the spellcasters to make sure that they can't cast any spells. The critical thing to remember, if you choose to tie sorcerers to bloodlines, is that bloodlines suddenly matter a lot in your world. Genealogy becomes very important indeed, and identifying those families who have otherworldly blood in them would be a top priority for power-hungry nobles everywhere. Political marriages would certainly still occur, but I would expect bloodline marriages to also play a large role in gaining power for a family. After all, if you marry your child off to a sorcerer, you're not unlikely to have a very powerful grandchild on the way pretty soon. Species such as tieflings, Aasimar, kobolds, and depending on your world's lore, dragonborn would be even more suspect than they already are, even as their inherited potentiality for sorcery would be coveted by some. Of course, when one's very ancestry can be a marker for both danger and great power, there is a much larger potential for the systematic oppression and elimination of certain powerful bloodlines. It's likely that paranoia may spread over the sorcerer threat. After all, other than sorcerers, you can usually tell if someone's undergoing training for their magic or their fighting prowess, or seems to have undergone some dramatic transformation through their faith, or some other entity that they've made a pact with. If, on the other hand, you choose to decouple sorcery from bloodlines, which I'm sure the kobolds would thank you for, they've been oppressed far too much already, there's some very interesting things you can do. But do remember, you can maintain some bloodline-based sorcery alongside the more esoteric options as well. Of course, that's what 5e intended. These are just some alternate suggestions. Firstly, you have the unenviable task of decoupling sorcerers from warlocks. A semantic differentiation based on the intentionality of getting their power isn't terribly useful, as some warlocks can make pacts relatively unknowingly. And the sorts of strange powers that might transform both classes are potentially similar. Each sorcerer will have an origin, not just mechanically as part of their class, but an actual origin story, like a superhero. Perhaps they were struck by lightning, or just so happened to glimpse the inner workings of a Modron. Maybe they had a far too close encounter with a mind-flayer tadpole, or had their minds brushed up against by the telepathy of an aboleth. In any case, as well as the sorceress origin, your sorcerer is going to have some biographical moment of awakening. Although still, this may be a little too close to warlocks for comfort. So what else can we change? One option is to shift the mechanics slightly. Instead of being Charisma Caster number 4, playing literal second fiddle to the bard's full casting repertoire, why not adopt the popular but niche suggestion of tying your sorcerer's main ability scores in your world to Constitution, as well as Charisma? After all, sorcerer's power comes from within. It is not gained through adoption of a pact. Sorcerers are physically changed by their encounter with the other. Their powers are theirs, not someone else's to give and retract. Constitution seems like the perfect set for a power set based in your own body. Not to mention that it pulls double duty in making the sorcerer actually unique in any aspect, and giving them a slight power bump. It also has the added hidden benefit of depowering the Charisma Caster cluster, which is used in a lot of multi-class concepts. Of course, this does require some balancing and tuning, as having everything run off Constitution can get a little much when your hit points, your spell attacks and spell saves, and your concentration checks all rely on one ability score. There are some good solutions to that problem floating around out there, though. Balancing out my critique of the charisma casting cluster of options, I will say that decoupling your sorcerers from this bloodline expectation does make multiclassing through roleplay a heck of a lot easier. It's quite often that I see tables push back against taking sorcerer levels after level 1. After all, if your sorcerer powers are innate to you, why didn't you have them to start with? This can lead to accusations of min-maxing, power gaming and all this sort of thing, which is especially potent considering that charisma is kind of the god stat for multi-class spellcasting. However, decoupling from this bloodline expectation through a close encounter with something bizarre, unusual, or incredibly powerful can give you all the roleplay justification you might need for taking a multi-class sorcerer level after level 1. Just finished hunting some eldritch horror in the astral plane? Well, perhaps this creature scarred your mind more than your companions, leading you to slowly develop an aberrant mind. Was your fighter just blasted by a mad mage's lightning? Or brought right to death's door by some shadow-touched enemy? Storm and shadow sorcery are calling. Gaining a level of sorcerer can become an interesting story beat. Not just an opportunity for a lot of table arguments and after-the-fact justification of your great-great-grandmother being somehow tied to the celestial realm. I'm sure this is obvious advice to some, but I do see this problem happening at enough tables that I feel it was really worth mentioning. Lastly, what if the sorcerer was more alien? After all, when we think about it, why should these guys be able to bend magic to their will, in some cases better than wizards, who literally wrote and read the book on arcane magic? Veterans of the channel may have some idea where I'm going with this, but hear me out. A class that's really lacking a special, unique identity, centred around powers that manifest within your own body alone, which are nonetheless capable of bending the laws of magic better than a wizard in some cases. With a few minor tweaks, the sorcerer class, with its indistinct flavour, can be reflavoured wonderfully. As a psionicist. Yes, it's not the best way to incorporate psionics into your setting. If you want to know what the best way is, well, you could try checking out my video up there. But if you make Subtle Spell a permanent class feature, for example, with a few minor tweaks along the way for balance reasons, because that is quite a powerful thing to do, you're most of the way there, and you can achieve the rest through flavour. I find this makes the sorcerer significantly more interesting. No longer are you beholden to a bloodline or some strange otherworldly force that deigns to make your body better and more magical. You, the sorcerer, or whatever you choose to call it, if you make these changes, are suddenly the master of your own will and destiny, capable of expanding the scope of what it is to use magic. Of course, this does require a compliant game master, judicious spell selection, and some reflavouring on your part. But in my mind, it's certainly worth it to impart an actual class identity onto the sorcerer, who is, in my mind, the most bland class in the entire game. barring their ability to use metamagic, of course. The worst problems that the Sorcerer faces are that its origins and theming are vague and often misunderstood, and that its class features often tend to step on the toes of other classes. But this can be mitigated, or even turned into a strength, if you have some idea of the style of story you would like to tell with the world you make and play in. There are many ways, not just mine, and certainly not just the ones I presented to you today. I hope this has got you thinking about the Sorcerer and all the myriad things that can be done with this class. Despite my criticism, I don't think that the Sorcerer is a bad class. I just think in this specific case, it can be worth going back to the books. One, in re-examining our understanding of what we believe a sorcerer to be and the associations that we might have from older editions or from the original player's handbook. And two, by remembering the advice of the Dungeon Master's Guide and much of D&D, in that we can change anything we don't like. It just makes it easier to change things if there's a solid foundation to build on. In essence, the Sorcerer is a decent and functional class, wrapped up in a dressing that is both too broad and too specific in the ways that the community keeps trying to use it. A bit of tinkering, and the Sorcerer can be whatever you want. Use and adapt the Sorcerer to highlight the unique features of magic in your world. Whether that be that the primordial powers rule over all, or whether the Shadowfell itself influences literally every aspect of the world. Theme your Sorcerer around what magic actually is. Just give it that fresh paint job, and it'll feel fresh and exciting. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing for more deep dives on world building within the bounds of the game's systems, and feel free to comment if you have any creative ideas or solutions on this particular topic. I'd love to hear them. With that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.